Thank you everyone for joining me today. If you were here for the talk just before about accessibility, we're continuing on, and there will be a talk about accessibility after this one as well, so stick around. So the agenda today, I'm going to go over a little bit about what web accessibility is. This presentation focuses on semantic markup and what you can do to prevent introducing accessibility issues into your code that didn't exist already. And we're going to look at this in a few different categories. So first we'll look at landmarks and headings, then we'll look at buttons and links, graphics, tables, and finally forms. So what is web accessibility? This is my definition here. Web accessibility is the extent to which a website or web application can be used by a disabled person. I think this is important to be clear about because there are different models of disability. The social model of disability says that our environment creates barriers and is what is inherently inaccessible about things like the web. I like to think about accessibility as a spectrum. So I have a little bar on the screen here that goes from less to more, and it has a little indicator towards the more end of the spectrum. And this is just to remind us that accessibility is not about perfection. It's about making progress and improving the user experience, but it's not about getting it 100% right out of the bag. As Josephine mentioned, sometimes accessibility issues can be in conflict with one another. You're not going to make everything accessible to everybody 100% of the time, but we can always be improving. I like this quote from Tim Berners-Lee about web accessibility. The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. So I know there are developers out there who think, oh, well, nobody with disability uses my site, or we don't have any screen reader users, but how would you know? You can't know this. And as Josephine also pointed out, there's a large number of people in the world with disabilities. In the United States, the estimate is 1 in 4 people, so 25% of the population. All right, so let's talk about semantic markup. It's comprised of 2 different things. The first thing that I'm going to harp on is using native HTML elements. So for example, on the screen here, we have a label element that might be holding a label for a form field. Then we have a simple link to home, and then we have the start and end of a table. So this is just some examples of out-of-the-box functionality that has semantic meaning and is accessible for folks. Added to using native elements, though, we have to think about ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. So we can think about roles and what are called ARIA-* attributes. So in the first example, I have a role attribute of listbox on an unordered list. So that semantically changes the nature of that. It's no longer an unordered list, it's now a listbox. And that semantically means something in the ARIA spec. Similarly, in the next example, we have a button, and the button has an ARIA label on it, which is one of those ARIA attributes, and the label says play. So we can imagine that this button is just an icon. It doesn't have a visible label, but we have to provide some kind of accessible label for folks who are using assistive technology, and we do that with ARIA label. I do want to point out that ARIA label, though, is a code smell. You can't just stick ARIA label on anything that you want. The element has to have semantic meaning. So if it's a div, it has to have a role in order for you to add ARIA label or ARIA labeled by. So the first rule of ARIA, do you guys know it? That's right, don't use ARIA. And it's very important because when you add ARIA, as Josephine mentioned again, the 1 million WebAIM 1 million home pages, almost exclusively 100% of those pages have some kind of ARIA issue. And when you have ARIA mistakes, you're changing the semantics and you're changing the behavior of the page in ways that is confusing for people with assistive technologies. So it's better to have no ARIA than to have bad ARIA. So let's look at what I call the less good example of using ARIA. So here we have a div. It's got a role of button. It has a tab index of 0 so that it actually gets keyboard focus. But you also have to do a lot of work. You have to do extra JavaScripting to make this button work with a keyboard, not just a mouse. So you have to make sure it has the correct role. We've got the role of button. It has to be keyboard focusable, and it has to work with the enter and space keys. And this is all stuff that you could get if you just used a button. So I'll never understand why developers want to tie themselves in knots to create their own buttons when they can just use the button element. Now, sometimes we're dealing with code that we didn't write ourselves and it's legacy and we're trying to fix things. But if you're starting greenfield, you're fresh, you're out of the box, button is your best bet here. So throughout the rest of this presentation, I'm going to use this example website that I made, accessibleweb.net, to demonstrate some of these semantic properties. Oops. You can go to accessibleweb.net/about to see this page. And this is a page that requires you to disable JavaScript in order to use it. It works great for a screen reader, but it's terrible for people with vision. And I came up with the idea of this from a developer who created a web page that you had to disable JavaScript in order to use. And it really made a lot of developers angry. They didn't understand why you would want to do this. And you know, there's not a lot of reasons to prevent your users from getting to your code. But this is in this way, you can maybe feel a little bit of what it's like to have a disability, because you can't get to the content easily unless you know how to disable CSS or view source. So I've got several short videos within this presentation that's going to kind of show you some examples of what's going on semantically. I'm just going to play the first one, and I've got captions on these videos in case the screen reader's talking too fast for you to understand. But let's just go ahead and hear what this page sounds like at the beginning here.
Accessible Web About document. Link Accessible Web. Complementary landmark. Please disable CSS to view this web page. Main landmark heading level 1. The web is inherently accessible. Block quote. Your weekly reminder that the web is accessible by default, and it's our design decisions that stop it being accessible. Number 11. Why link Kevin Molinaro on Twitter, December 7, 2020. Out of block quote. Why did you have to disable CSS to view this website? No reason other than a design choice that excludes sighted people. Did you know? This is how many visitors view web pages already. List with 5 items: bullet search engines, bullet bots, bullet site crawlers, bullet analytics, bullet blind people. Out of list. This website is fully accessible to people with screen readers and braille displays. But many websites are not, due to poor design choices that exclude some people.
Okay, and if you want to see that code, you can go to accessibleweb.net/GitHub, and it will redirect you to the repository. So let's talk about landmarks and headings. So landmarks and headings break up content into meaningful sections that screen reader users can access to navigate the page quickly. Let's look at landmarks first. So there are HTML elements for creating landmarks, and then there are their corresponding ARIA roles. So these are the main ones. There are others. These are just the most commonly used ones. So you have aside, which is your complementary landmark role. You have footer, which is announced as content info. You have your header, which is announced as banner. Main is main, nav is navigation, and your sectioning element will only be announced, it will be announced as a region if you apply an ARIA label or an ARIA labeled by attribute to it. Otherwise, it's sort of an invisible landmark. So this is just a really simple screenshot of what that code might look like. We've got 3 landmarks: our header, our main, and our footer landmarks. And then within the main landmark, we have our heading hierarchy, starting with an H1, the web is inherently accessible, followed by an H2 semantics, and an H3 for headings. So let's hear what it sounds like for a screen reader to navigate a page. First, we're going to hear it navigating by the landmarks on the page, and then we're going to hear it navigating by the headings on the page.
Banner landmark. Link accessible web. Complementary landmark. Please disable CSS to view this web page. Main landmark. The web is inherently accessible. Heading level 1. Content info landmark. Call off on heading level 2. No next landmark. Banner landmark. Link accessible web. Main landmark. The web is inherently accessible. Heading level 1. What is web accessibility? Heading level 2. Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, heading level 3. Semantics heading level 2. Headings heading level 3. Buttons and links heading level 3. Buttons heading level 4. Links heading level 4. Images heading level 3. List with 3 items. Alt text heading level 4. SVG icons heading level 4. SVG charts and graphs heading level 4. Tables heading level 3. Forms heading level 3. In summary heading level 2. Content info landmark. Call off on heading level 2. No next heading.
So when the screen reader gets to the end of the number of landmarks that are available or the number of headings, it will let you know. It'll say no next landmark or no next heading. And Josephine showed the rotor on Mac, but if you're using like NVDA or JAWS, you have a separate way to bring up just a list of all of the headings on the page or just a list of all of the landmarks or the links, and you can navigate pretty quickly through this little submenu rather than forcing the browser to like go through each and every single link or heading like we just listened to. So let's talk a bit about buttons and links. These get conflated often. Sometimes they look the same, sometimes they act the same. But in terms of what works for assistive technology, a button is something that performs an action on the page. So if a screen reader user hears that a control is a button, they have one expectation. A link takes the user to a new URL. So if a control announces itself as a link, screen reader users expect to be taken to a new web page. Now, buttons can have some other ARIA attributes other than ARIA label like we already looked at. And the two most common for expressing the state of a button are ARIA expanded and ARIA pressed. So here we have just a simple button that says send. Now we have a button for a menu. We're going to pretend that this menu is not expanded. So we have ARIA expanded as false. When our menu is enabled and visual, we would change this to ARIA expanded equals true, and that will convey the state of the control to screen readers. Same with ARIA pressed. Here we have a control for enabling light mode on a website, and we have ARIA pressed equals true, and it will announce itself as a toggled on. So let's hear what those sound like with a screen reader.
Buttons and links heading level 3. Buttons heading level 4. List with 8 items menu button collapsed. Expanded. Button expanded search. Not pressed. Toggle button not pressed dark mode. Pressed. Toggle button pressed light mode.
Okay, and similarly with links, we have different kinds of links. We have a link that goes external to a website. We can have in-page links like a skip to content link, or we can have email links for email addresses. Let's listen to what those sound like with the screen
Links
reader.
heading level 4. List with 8 items same page link. Link headings. New page link. Link accessible web tool. External link. Link Electronic Frontier Foundation opens in a new tab. Email link. Link info@eff.org.
And something I neglected to include in this video is, at least for NVDA and JAWS, they will also communicate if a link is already visited, which is pretty useful. So let's take a look at graphics. So the goal with graphics is to provide an accurate text equivalent for all graphical objects, and this includes using the image element for inline images, as well as things like charts and graphs, and increasingly meaningful icons next to things like links and text. So the easiest example is you just have a photograph like this one. You have an alt attribute. This one is 2 cats on an easy chair under a blanket. If you decided this is a decorative image, you just leave your alt attribute empty. But it is important to have the alt attribute because otherwise some browsers and screen reader combinations will try to read the file name of the file instead of ignoring it if it's decorative. If you have an inline SVG icon, like this example here, we can do a couple of things to make it meaningful, if it is meaningful. So in this context, we're going to say that this little headset icon is meaningful. And inside of our link for the telephone number, we have some inline SVG. And in order to make it meaningful, we've done 2 things. We've added a role of image so that we're saying this SVG is acting like an image. And then we're giving it an ARIA label because we have given it a role. And it's the word call. So this would get announced as call graphic 1-800-922-9999, and we'll hear that in a second. Conversely, if you have a decorative icon, for example, this location pin next to find a location, you can set that to ARIA hidden equals true if it is completely decorative. We can just tell the screen reader to ignore it. Otherwise, it might try to read some aspect of the SVG depending on the screen reader and browser combination that you're using. So ARIA hidden equals true will just completely take it out of the assistive technologies view, and you should be really careful with this one. I sometimes hesitate to talk about ARIA hidden equals true because you, in one tiny attribute, could hide your entire page from any screen reader if you put that on the body tag, for example. If we have an SVG chart like this one, this is not an interactive chart, and just imagine it's a bar chart created with SVG, but there's no functionality going on, but we do need to provide some kind of text equivalent for folks who cannot actually see and interact with the chart. So when we're labeling a chart, again, we can use role equals image, and for our ARIA label, we can provide a description. Here for the one that I just had up here, it's a bar chart showing the years 2016 to 2021 as the percentage of US consumers with a streaming video service increased from 52% to 78%. So let's hear how those sound like with NVDA.
Images heading level 3. List with 3 items, alt text heading level 4. 2 cats on an easy chair under a blanket graphic. SVG icons heading level 4. List with 2 items, call graphic 1, 800-799-7233 link. Find a location link. SVG charts and graphs heading level 4. Bar chart showing the years 2016 to 2021 as the percentage of US consumers with a streaming video service increased from 52% to 78%. Graphic.
Okay, so to dovetail from this chart into the next topic, which is tables, it's important that even if someone can't interact with this table, they should be able to access all of the data in this table. So what we can do is, for all of your users, you can include a table of the data points in this chart as a supplemental to the graphic to be more understandable for folks, especially people with screen readers who can't see the graphic itself. So tables are perfectly fine to use as long as you're using them for tabular data. Tables format tabular data into a grid that assistive technology can actually navigate. So here's an example of what that table might look like with all of our data points from the chart. Here's our quick and dirty HTML. The only thing I want to point out here is our first row in our table, we're using the TH element instead of the TD element. That's for table header. And that is really important as far as how screen readers will communicate the information within the table. And it can tell you which row you're on, which column you're on, and then what the applicable data is, and we'll hear that in a second. I also included the caption element. If you have more than one table on a page, you need to provide a caption so that screen reader users can differentiate between the tables on the page. Otherwise, it's not necessary, but it is nice. So let's hear what the table of this data element sound like.
Tables heading level 3. US consumers with a streaming video subscription table with 7 rows and 2 columns. US consumers with a streaming video subscription caption. Row 1, column 1 year. Column 2, US consumers. Row 2 year, column 1 2016. US consumers, column 2 52%. Row 3 year, column 1 2017. US consumers, column 2 64%. Row 4 year, column 1 2018. US consumers, column 2 69%. Row 5 year, column 1 2019. US consumers, column 2 74%. Row 6 year, column 1 2020. US consumers, column 2 78%. Row 7 year, column 1 2021. US consumers, column 2 78%. Out of table heading level 3 forms.
And so just like with our landmarks and our headings, when it gets to the end of the landmarks or headings, when it gets to the end of the table, it'll tell you that it's out of the table if you're navigating the content sequentially. All right, so lastly, let's look at forms, which are my favorite thing accessibility-wise. So with forms, we need to provide labels, and labels provide visible and accessible names to form inputs when they are programmatically linked, and inputs determine the type of data. So let's look at a really simple example of a form. We have a label here, your email, for an input, and we want to programmatically link the label to the input. And this may seem really basic, but every day I see folks not doing this. And when you don't do this, 2 things happen. One, you can't click on the label to get focus on the form field if they're not programmatically linked. This is particularly important for like radio buttons and checkboxes, which have a really small hit area. If you have your label and your input programmatically linked, then you can click on the label to actually select that checkbox or radio button. The other thing that this does is when a screen reader focuses on your input, it will actually tell you what the name of the input is. Otherwise, they're forced to hear the label separately from the input, and it can be kind of confusing, especially if you have multiple checkboxes and it's just telling you checkbox unchecked, checkbox unchecked, and not telling you the label that's corresponding with it. There are different input types, of course, type equals text. There are other ones that can, constrain the type of data that's being entered into your input. So if you have a type equals email, the browser can do some sort of cursory HTML5 error detecting to make sure you put an actual email address in there. I have a whole talk about structuring accessible forms, though, where I say that it's really not good to rely on HTML5 browser validation, but I think the battery, oh, there we go. Yeah, so there's an email radio checkbox, of course, and there are other types like search, URL, and tell that will further constrict what kind of data can be entered into those inputs. Let's listen to what these form fields sound like. The first form field, the your name field, has the required attribute for saying that it's a required field, which enables the HTML5 form field validation. The email form uses ARIA required equals true, which disables the HTML5 form field validation. So we generally suggest using ARIA required equals true and not required. And this is what this sounds like.
Forms heading level 3. Your name, required, edit required blank. Email, ARIA required equals true, edit required blank. Send button. Please fill out this field. Alert, your name, required, edit required blank.
So we can see one of the problems with using the HTML form field validation is it disappears. It's also not very easy to change the styling, the position, how long, the duration. All of these things make those error messages pretty inaccessible. So that's why we avoid using the required attribute, instead use ARIA required equals true. Lastly, I just want to talk about grouping similar fields. It's really important that if you do have groups of like radio buttons and checkboxes, that you're giving them a semantic group name. So we use a field set for that. Field sets will group related fields, and legends provide a label for that grouped control. And this is what that HTML looks like. We've got a field set, we have a legend, what products are you interested in? And then there are several checkboxes that we'll see in the video. The first checkbox is for banking. You can see that even though we have our input as a child of our label element, we're still programmatically connecting those two using the for and ID attributes of the label and the input to make sure that they work across all browser and screen reader combinations. So let's listen to what a grouped set of checkboxes is like.
What products are you interested in? Grouping banking checkbox not checked. Checked. Not checked. Investments checkbox not checked. Loans checkbox not checked. Credit cards checkbox not checked. Out of grouping heading level 2 in summary.
Yeah, so again, just like with tables and headings, when you're out of the grouping, if you're reading the contents straight through in the browser, it will tell you when you're out of that grouping and onto the next form field if there is one. So that's all I have for today. So I'll just go over my in summary. As I said, web accessibility is an ongoing process. It's about progress over perfection. We want to use semantic markup whenever we can, and that's a mix of native HTML elements as well as the appropriate ARIA. Headings and landmarks really help people navigate, particularly screen reader users and people using Braille displays. Buttons and links do different things. Graphics need text equivalents most of the time, if they're not decorative at least. We use tables for tabular data, and we want to structure forms in accessible ways. And that's all I have. Thank you. You can reach me on Twitter at Rachelle DiTullio, my email, rachellditullio@protonmail.com. And if you want these slides, they're on my website, rachellditullio.com/talks/the web is inherently accessible. Thank you.